She was one of my students many years ago. Well, not that many actually. But so I'm tempted to tell like student stories, like when she walked into my office to apply for a position at the Women's Center and said, "I want to be a volcanologist." And I said, "Every women's center needs a volcanologist. You're hired." And the rest is history, as they say. But now I will, go into the official bio to let you know some of her bona fides, set the stage for her talk today. Ms. Crow has spent the last 25 years doing volunteer work and community advocacy in San Francisco and Seattle. Most of her community work has centered on social issues involving the Chicano community and undocumented migrants. She received her AA in Earth and Space Sciences in 2006. See, it's that volcanology thing, set the stage for everything. She then went on to do a BA at the University of Washington in archaeology and anthropology. Her passion for working with at-risk and clandestine populations led her to earn an MA in sociocultural anthropology and archaeology in 2013 at the University of Arkansas. She also, while in Seattle, worked at the Center for Advanced Spatial Technologies, which I don't even know what it is, but I'm sure it impresses some of you, right? If you're impressed, raise your hand. Good job. Yeah. She's taught social science and biology courses at Bellevue College, University of Arkansas, and the University of Washington. Since 2008, she's worked on a variety of undocumented migration projects analyzing components of the migration experience at the U.S.-Mexico border, and has been featured in Archaeology Magazine and Contemporary Anthropology. Her research includes unauthorized human migration, migrant-based humanitarian aid organizations, and sexual violence in migration, death and dying in the desert, military-industrial complexes, law enforcement checkpoints, and militarized law enforcement agencies. She has done field work in southern Arizona and has been featured on our local NBC news stations and other local news stations on more than one occasion. So when you saw that years ago, you had no idea she'd be here in person. Most recently, she spent her honeymoon in Israel and Palestine during the summer's 54-day war, researching border checkpoints and border wall surveillance. A dream honeymoon. Thank you, Zeus. So without further ado, I would like to introduce one of the students of whom I'm extremely proud, and I hope the information she has to share with you will be worthwhile today. So, Consuelo Crow.
Thank you. I'm a loud talker, so if this gets too loud, let me know, because I usually do full lectures without a microphone, and my students can usually hear me just fine. Just a fair warning. Thank you, Melanie. I appreciate all of you being here. Hopefully I can give you something to take away from this talk with some of the things that I've learned over the years doing the work that I've been doing. She said I did spend my honeymoon in Israel and Palestine during the war over the summer, and I only have the best for my husband. Dragging him around, looking at all sorts of interesting topics, and being surrounded by machine guns and interrogation and skunk trucks and all sorts of things. So, the picture that I have up as the title page is Qalandia Checkpoint. And much of this talk is going to be centered around this particular checkpoint. When we were in Israel and Palestine, this checkpoint played a very huge role in how we handled our travel and what times of day or what day of the week we would actually travel to and from, in and out of Palestine and Israel. One of the things that's of note, and this picture will come up again, but I'll just point this out really quickly. You see this guard tower here, which is pretty tall. All of these walls and everything are really, really tall. And on the back side here, they actually have a ladder that the IDF climbs so they can peek over and watch people and see what they're doing. So the reason why this tower in this area is blackened this way is because every Friday at about 2 p.m., they have a riot. The people who live in Qalandia refugee camp, which is just less than a mile off to the side here, they come out and they start throwing rocks. and setting things on fire. The IDF joins in with their riot gear and their machine guns and start throwing tear gas, smoke bombs, live bullets, rubber bullets, all sorts of things. One of the things that's very interesting about it is that it becomes a very staged situation in the beginning, and by nighttime it can go any direction, in which sometimes people do in fact die. TV cameras that are well marked with their crews will actually come out and stand pretty close to the action, and we'll film this as IDF kind of halfway pays attention as they advance. And then you have the kids with their rocks, and they're shooting them off or throwing them, or maybe a Molotov cocktail are on the other side throwing, and it's sort of this coordinated effort because it's been going on for so long that everybody has their role and they know what that is. It's very interesting. So on Fridays by 2 p.m., if you are not over the line, you're in trouble. You might get caught up in that riot. So it did dictate how we traveled. So it's hard to see, and I will come in closer, but this is a UN map of what is now considered to be Israel and the Palestinian territories of Gaza and the West Bank. We have the West Bank here in the darker region. The red line that you see is where the actual physical border wall sits right now as we speak. If we come into East Jerusalem, which is bisected by this wall. Now, the problem with this is that East Jerusalem, according to the UN, the green line that was determined in 1949 actually runs on the other side of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is supposed to be, and technically by law, is the West Bank and a Palestinian territory. But what Israel has done in this place, as well as in other places, is they have intentionally built their wall around the old city, so that the old city lives on the Israeli side, and they can take over and frequent it. And there are a lot of weird things that go on. There's the Jewish quarter, there's the Christian quarter, the Muslim quarter. It is definitely heavily segregated within the old city. What runs in front of the old city that bisects the East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem sides, and in West Jerusalem you have very Orthodox Jews living in this area. You have a big giant road where there is a light rail trolley that runs. And it was pointed out to me while we were there that that is the green line that the UN set in 1949. That's where the Israeli wall should be, but it's not. Israel has taken a lot of liberties into where they have placed the wall. There was one story that we were told that the wall had taken this strange turn around in this small field because there was an Israeli woman who was killed there. And so Israel decided to claim that piece of land. Whether that's true or not, I don't know for sure. I was not able to verify it. But these are the kinds of things that people talk about in the region. And it is a metaphor for many things. So here we have the old city where you have Dome of the Rock, you have the quarters, you have all sorts of different people living here. You have mosques, you have synagogues, you have the Wailing Wall. The Wailing Wall you see a lot in the news and in pictures where people go and they cry and they pray, and they also write little notes and stuff it into the wall, their wishes and prayers and requests of God. And so this is where all of this takes place. So here you see a cemetery. And what's happened is Jews have bought up that entire piece of land, even though it is on Mount of Olives, which is traditionally an Arab area. And we were told by a gentleman who lives in Mount of Olives that a lot of the plots were bought up by Jews who live in New York City. Now again, we can talk about race, we can talk about class systems and that sort of thing. This may be true, this may not be true, but what is true is that it's predominantly Jewish people who have bought up this land to be buried in, because it faces the old city. So that entire hillside faces the old city, and so Jews want to be buried there. And here, this is where that boulevard runs, where it is the UN Green Line. Here we have the drag that is at the US-Mexico border outside of Douglas, Arizona. And I don't know how many of you have ever gone down to the border anywhere here in Arizona. Certainly on the outskirts, outside of the urban areas. But I was talking to somebody earlier that between Douglas and Naco, where there are 2 points of entry, it's open land, and you have the drag like this that the Border Patrol uses to patrol the area for people who have crossed over the wall unauthorized. You have 13 different types of fencing that exist. From everything to sheet metal that stands about 13 feet tall, to Normandy barriers so that people cannot drive through, but you can still walk over. One of the things that they do have at that border all along is they have motion sensors, kind of like what they use to measure earthquakes. What the USGS uses, it measures tremors. They also do this now at the US-Canadian border. I've actually walked some of the smuggling trails with Border Patrol up there, and they've put sensors into the ground, so whenever they go off, they can actually count the number of bodies that are crossing through that trail. And that helps them determine how many agents they want to send out for apprehension. So we have the border wall here in Bethlehem, and the border wall in Bethlehem tends to be a little more famous only because the artist Banksy has visited there quite a bit and done some famous pieces. Some of you may have seen a piece that he did with Joseph and Mary on a donkey trying to cross through the Jerusalem Valley to the North Star to get to the old city, but were blocked by the wall. It's one of his most famous pieces, and that was here in Bethlehem. Some of that art has been either removed or painted over at this point. People also poach it so that they can sell it. So you may or may not see a Banksy. He shows up in strange places every once in a while. He was recently actually in Gaza. He walked through one of the quote-unquote terror tunnels and went into Gaza for 24 hours and interviewed people and did a couple of art pieces and then walked back out. They still don't know who he is. So this is my husband standing in front of the wall on the border drag outside of the Douglas, Arizona area. And as you can see, the US has some very funny ways of fixing the way that people walk over the walls or climb over the walls. Instead of having good infrastructure to begin with, they sort of piecemeal together pieces of the wall using surplus from the Korean War, from the Vietnam War, and now also from the first Gulf War. So what they did, they had this in place, and it used to be just a bar. But because people were able to shimmy it up and down, they started welding plates. Now people can actually climb over those plates. I've seen people scale those in seconds. It's not a problem to climb over most of our walls. Some of the similarities that you're going to find between the borders in Israel and Palestine and US-Mexico is that there is an Italian theorist named Giorgio Agamben who has written about the state of emergency and the state of exception. The state of emergency means that we have identified that there's a problem and there's something that needs to urgently be done about it. But what that entails is we we have to identify what the problem is and who's causing it. So then we have to create an enemy. And through the creation of an enemy, we often create a phenotype out of that. When we use the word illegal, undocumented, we often conjure up a certain phenotype. When we talk about Palestinians or people living in the West Bank, we conjure up a phenotype. We have an idea of what these people look like, the other, the enemy, the people who are the infidels, the infiltrators, the traitors, the people who create problems. We have to watch out for them. So we declare this state of emergency because this enemy is causing this problem. Now we have to fix it. So you have your state of emergency, which creates the state of exception out of that perceived enemy. The state of exception allows for governmental agencies and militaries to suspend quotidian law in favor for what is theoretically supposed to be a temporary law in place until the emergency has passed. Unfortunately, it's been a long time since we declared that particular state of emergency, right? And we just keep building and building and building and furthering the threat narrative of the undocumented migrant. In Israel, we have terrorists that we talk about, and they are Palestinian Arabs. They may be Muslim, they may not be. There are lots of Christians in the Arab world. But we have identified them as the problem, and we need to watch out for them. Therefore, we need to contain them so that we can watch them. So we build walls that have surveillance. And the surveillance, over time, has been upped more and more and more. We started out with walls, simple walls, fencing, barbed wire, chain link fencing, and now it's manifested into giant walls of metal and concrete and concertina wire. In Douglas, Arizona, they have a moat. In Douglas, Arizona, they do a lot of their testing of new technologies there because it's not a hugely high crossing point, but also it's pretty remote and it's harder for humanitarians to access than in, say, Nogales. So they do a lot of their preliminary testing out there for different technologies, whether it's high technology or low technology. But what they've done is they've built a moat. And when they started building that moat in 2010, I actually walked up to the contractors and started trying to talk to them. They didn't like that. And I asked them directly, are you building a moat? And he just shook his head at me and he's like, no, this is just for drainage. You know how it is here, it rains here. Yes, I understand it rains here. I get it. There's a monsoon season. But what they've built is a moat. And the anatomy of that moat, there's a picture here, and let's get to that. Let me start by saying, this is outside of Marivaca, Arizona. We have the threat. This is in Qalandia checkpoint. We have a threat. It's a little more intense here because they say you have a threat to your life if you cross into the West Bank. Here, they say, well, you may, deal some smuggling and some illegal people, and you never know what they're going to do, but, we already have a perceived threat. We have checkpoints where people will walk through or drive through, where they will inspect your vehicles, whether it's legally or illegally. By law, the U.S. Border Patrol is only allowed to ask you what your citizenship is. But they continually go further because often they are allowed to get away with breaking the rules. These are, checkpoint areas in Qalandia where people go through in the cars. You can see all the barbed wire and the fencing and all the surveillance with the lights and the cameras and all sorts of things going on. So that there's the constant feeling that there's threat. You have to be on alert at all times. They use surplus just like we do. Like you see the blocks here, they use pieces of concrete, and sometimes for no reason they will actually just shut off that checkpoint altogether for extended periods of time, and you have no idea why it's been shut down or how long it's going to be shut down. And so people who live like in the Ramallah area or in any of the refugee camps, they have to actually go way out of their way to get to a place where they can actually cross. But that creates problems too, because here in Israel and Palestine, you have issues where there are checkpoints where you can cross if you're a Palestinian. But there are checkpoints that you're only allowed to cross if you are Israeli. And they have Israeli-only roads, and we'll get to the license plates. At Qalandia checkpoint, when you're walking through, this is the first thing you start walking through. This is the only one that they have. It is lined on top with fencing, and it is that wide. It's a cattle run. You can't get out, you can't turn around. And then you hit turnstiles, which then further lock you in. But that, you're still not all the way there. So you keep going through a series of mazes and tunnels and fences to get to the point where they check your documentation. But even then, you're still not done. In the Douglas, Arizona area, I had been told about something new that had shown up, and I will tell you right now, I still do not have verification yet on exactly what these are being used for, but there's a whole lot of speculation out there. You have these cages here with the concertina wire, and you have the portable surveillance towers that people get into, and then they raise up and you can actually see pretty far all the way around at 360. We were told by a Border Patrol agent that they were only used to store equipment, but we couldn't quite figure out what kind of equipment would be stored in there. I will also tell you, this is not the only cage out there, there were several that we saw. I did find evidence of humans having been put in these. Because Border Patrol, when they go out to the field and apprehend people, they use plastic zip ties to keep people handcuffed. There were cut ties in the cages. Now, they could have been using those zip ties to tie together equipment. Again, I can't say for sure, but there was some evidence. There were some footprints in there. There were some things that indicated that someone had been inside those cages. Whether it was somebody who had been apprehended, I don't know. There was a strange situation where when we were inspecting the cages, Border Patrol agent, does anybody know what drag tires are? So the Border Patrol, what they do is they take giant tires and they chain them all together. And they put them on the back of the truck, and they run up and down the drag with these tires to clear out footprints. They use them to clear out other tire marks, and this is a way that they surveil. It's called cutting a sign. And this is how they watch to see if there's anything new showing up there that they need to be aware of. So we were at, I think it was the third cage, and this is the cage where we found some evidence of humans having been inside this cage. A Border Patrol agent actually hooked up the drag tires and very quickly came driving fast around and did drag with the tires around them and covering up any evidence of anything else ahead of us. I had never seen that before. So anything we may or may not have found was covered up at that point. So we did find some lights that were inside one of the cages. So again, still unsure what they're using these for. Some people have said that they have seen people inside of them, exposed to the elements. I don't know. So they have these, and we did have one of the border agents tell us that these lights were often firebombed with like Molotov cocktails, which I had never heard of and I had never seen. but it's possible. Throwing rocks, possibly at the lights to black them out. But where these were situated from the border fence, that person would have to be awfully strong to lob anything and actually aim for that one light. So it's hard to say what these are, but there are several of them out there. So when you're walking through the checkpoints, there are x-ray machines either for trucks, or they have the personal ones where you have to put your bags through when you're going through customs. So those are pretty okay here. It's not a huge deal. But here in Qalandia, so you have the cattle area over here, and it leads you out to this open area, and you have to get yourself into a stall where you wait in front of another spiral fence. Those spiral fences are on either side of this cage. This is completely caged in on both sides. They lock those cages, and you can't get out until they decide to let you out. So they let in about 3 people at a time through these, and these are locked, and then there's another one on the other side. Here, next to this gentleman on the side of the wall, they have another x-ray machine where you have to put your stuff through so that they can inspect it. And then this is the window here where they inspect your documents, and you have IDF sitting on the other side. They have loudspeakers. When I was in, for the first time, one of these cages, I didn't understand that they locked both sides, and it was terrifying. He was separated from me. I had my documents, and one of the problems that we were having when we were in Israel and Palestine is that my husband, who is Jewish, looks Israeli Jew. He was often mistaken as an Israeli Jew all the time. And I was being mistaken for Palestinian. So then, it was difficult for people to deal with the fact that he looked Israeli Jew and I looked Palestinian, and we were walking together, and then on top of that, sort of breaking the code and touching each other, which is sort of forbidden, especially in places like Jerusalem, where people are very conservative. So we were separated, and the IDF soldiers who were back here thought I was Arab. And they were screaming at me in this loudspeaker in a way that I didn't understand. I don't speak Arabic, I don't speak Hebrew, but they were screaming at me, and I kept telling them in English, I have no idea what's going on, I don't know what you want me to do. So all he could do was stand on the other side of the fence and watch. And these 2 Palestinian guys were helping me in their broken English as best as they could to tell me which way to go. And basically, the IDF, all they were telling me to do was just walk back and forth, because they could. All they wanted me to do was walk from one side to the other, and back, and back, and back, because they could. So, eventually, I was able to show them my documentation. So I have my US passport. I was born and raised here. I have my US passport, and I show them. And as soon as they saw that, they stopped yelling at me and started speaking English to me, which I didn't expect them to speak English to me, but they stopped yelling at me. That was the important point of that. And then I was able to get through. I had these 2 Palestinian people ahead of me who were elderly, and they were also being screamed at horribly by these IDF kids. Most of the IDF soldiers are kids. They're very young. And they aren't trained very well. And they're allowed to do some things that are not okay, including being abusive in these controlling situations where you have no control over yourself. So they eventually let me out, and a whole bunch of nervous laughter on my part after that, because I had no idea what had happened to me. So we're back to this. Do all of you know who Arafat is? He was a Palestinian Authority leader who was killed during the Second Intifada in Ramallah, and we actually did go and see his tomb. which apparently is not visited very often anymore, which is really sad. It's a beautiful site. If you're ever over there, I highly recommend it. So we have Arafat, who is represented here. We have all sorts of different things. A lot of the Arabic I of course, couldn't translate or understand. Now, we had come in a week after there was a particular riot that, as we were told, it was the largest that had been there in 10 years, and there were some deaths. And people were sort of feeding off of this. What sparked that particular riot was that the week before that, 2 young Palestinian kids were shot over the wall with live bullets, shot dead by IDF. And there's actual videotape of both of them in the streets. They were not doing anything, they were walking. And they were just shot down in the street. So it sparked a series of riots, and then also being there during the wartime with that heightened sense of alert was raising the bar in how people were rioting in this area while we were there. We have the observation fences here in Arizona. This is outside of Arivaca, Arizona. One of the big differences between the way that they have the watchtower set up is that, as you saw in Qalandia, they have the tower with the black windows, and that is a very Foucauldian panopticon way of dealing with surveillance or perceived surveillance. The black glass helps them with that by not being able to tell whether there's actually somebody in there watching. But there are also cameras and floodlights and everything that looks very nefarious and very threatening. So you must watch your behavior. Here, we have something called virtual fence that some of you may know about. Obama scrapped it in August of 2010 because it was ineffective and it didn't reach very far, and it was costing millions of dollars. It's now being revamped and revised again with Boeing. And they are designing and developing new technologies to reinstate that program so that it will reach farther and do a better job. So what they have so far is they have dishes for communication. They don't have the biotechnology that they want up there, but that is in the works as we speak right now, where they are going to be able to theoretically determine the difference between a human and an animal. Right now they're using a lot of infrared censoring that Border Patrol agents have on their physical person when they go out and survey the land out there at night. And I've actually had migrants tell me that they have dressed themselves up in a way that they think they look like animals to avoid detection. They've slathered themselves in mud, they've taken sticks and used them as antlers, or tried to act like bears on all fours as they're crawling through the desert. So it'll be interesting to see when that new technology comes up, how that works. I've actually seen some of the technology that's already in place up at the US-Canada border. I've been in the monitoring rooms there at the Border Patrol station in Linden, and it's pretty incredible what they can already do and how close they can get those cameras to zoom in on people's faces. People who are driving miles away from the center, you can actually zoom in on their face as they're driving. So the technology's, it's pretty advanced as it is, and they're trying to get it to go further so that they can actually reduce the number of agents that are out there. Yes? It's just a general biotechnology. They have different points and brands in which they're trying to create that where it detects. But the biggest thing that they're working on right now is trying to develop something that will determine human versus animal. Because they have a lot of false starts. Because animals will trip things, or they think it's a human, but they're not sure, ends up being a bear, or something of that nature. Lots of Halloween out here. And then we have the portable stations, which get dragged all over the place, and again, they go up, they go down. And they also use these quite a bit in monitoring things like football games. The Border Patrol here in the United States has a radius of 100 miles of patrol. And for internal checkpoints that are not at the actual geopolitical border, it's 60 miles. So this is why when you go to Tucson, you're going to see, one, a lot of Border Patrol agents around because one of the headquarters is there, but you're also on I-19. If you're going anywhere near Nogales, you're going to see the checkpoints that I showed you on the freeway because they can. And there are internal checkpoints in smaller towns where people are sort of under this type of siege. They can't get to work. They can't get to school. They can't go to the grocery store without crossing one of these. And that's created a lot of problems. And in the town of Aravaca right now, they have a coalition of some of the citizens there trying to get those checkpoints removed so that they can move about a little more freely. Iron Dome. So virtual fence technology is what we have here in the United States. The Iron Dome was a really big deal while we were there during the war. So the idea is that there is missile detection, and the Iron Dome would, within seconds, calculate the speed and the mass of what was coming at it and what direction. It would project what direction it would go to in order to understand where it might land. So that it would shoot off these missiles that were $60,000 a piece every time to destroy and intercept that missile that was coming from Gaza, for example. So the Iron Dome was a real big thing, and there was a lot of patriotism built around this, and we saw these billboards everywhere, and as you can see, it hit pop culture. People were buying t-shirts and mugs and all sorts of things about the Iron Dome. But people, like on the news, you would see these people who would make lunches and all sorts of things and take them out to soldiers who were manning the Iron Dome. And it was sort of a source of pride, a call to duty, sort of similar to the way in World War II you had victory gardens and things like that. It was sort of a duty that you were asked to perform. So scrap metals, I had mentioned that earlier. This is something that I found also out by Douglas, Arizona. They've recently replaced the wall and put in, for example, the moat. What they did with the rest of the old fencing I wasn't sure about, and then I was driving way out in the desert and I found the old fencing and they've just piled it up out in the desert. I don't know if they have any intention of doing anything with this stuff. They'll probably repurpose it some way. But this is what's happened to the old fence where it used to be just bars. Now it's bars and concertina wire and a moat and also mesh fencing. They've definitely upped the ante, and they also have these big rolling gates, iron gates, to get in and out so that they can apprehend people who may have made it over the first wall. And then again, with the surplus that they use, this is Qalandia. We've been looking over here at the watchtower. This area goes into the city of Ramallah. And there's an entire strip there where they have barriered off the streets. And then what they do in order to close Qalandia is they move all of this stuff and they shut off the roads and make everybody drive into each other in one tiny lane, which is terrifying. Another way that people have sort of recreated the border and boundary issue is in the old city. The different quarters, there's a lot of contention, certainly at this time with the war going on. So what has happened is Jews and Arabs are living next door to each other, literally. So what's happened is they have started taking barbed wire and that sort of thing and putting them up on the walls to keep people out or determine where the borders and the boundaries are of where people can and cannot be, where they're allowed to be. Also, in the old city, you're allowed to place giant Israeli flags all over. But if anybody puts up a Palestinian flag, they will be arrested, even if they own that home. And many of the people living in the old city have been there for generations. More floodlights. The Tohono O'odham Reservation is another strange place to see things. It's harder to access some of the stuff that's going on down there if you are not a member or if you are not with a member. I am not a member of the Tohono O'odham tribe, but I am a member of the Pasquayaqui tribe. And so I'm given a little more leeway, even though I'm not part of that particular nation. So here we have all of the floodlights to watch. And the thing about this is that the O'odham Reservation has been split between Mexico and the United States, even though that entire land is still all O'odham, and their relatives live on both sides. So there are special concessions made, although they're still given a lot of trouble. If you are a registered member, then you are able to drive or walk through that fence to go see your relatives on the other side in the Mexican territories. And this is the fencing here that they have, and that's it. And so people cross here quite a bit. There's a lot of funneling that goes on into the reservation, because if somebody dies on the reservation, the Indian reservation is responsible for the costs of taking care of that body, not the U.S. government. So there's a lot of intentional funneling involved. And one of the interesting things about the border walls in the Middle East, as well as here, is that they're sort of backwards in the way that they work. Here in the United States, border walls are actually built up huge and large in the urban areas. A lot of it's for show, a lot of it is for security purposes, but then they dwindle down, as we've seen, to something like this out in the most remote areas. I've actually had some border agents tell me that they joke about deterrence by death out here in the desert. It's not an official policy, but I've had this said to me before. Whereas in the Middle East, the walls are much lower and smaller. They're huge, don't get me wrong. They have the concertina wire, and they certainly make an effort to keep people on the other side of the wall. But they get bigger in the remote areas. Bigger and scarier and much harder to climb. So it's an interesting juxtaposition about the way that they've handled this. One of the things that we have to remember too is that Israel and the United States share a lot of plans with each other. We've all gotten ideas from each other on how to handle these and build these walls and do the security. And so somebody comes up with something, hand it off, trade, whatever works. So this is the fabled moat that's out in Douglas. So as you can see, the infrastructure that they have started building in certain areas has a double wall situation. Nobody else has a moat like this yet, though. Some of the areas have triple fencing now, and they have areas that you get trapped into. So if you manage to make it over that second fencing or wall, you still get trapped in there. But it gives Border Patrol time to show up and apprehend people. So this is a new method in which they're employing to capture people. But this moat, which at the time was dry, will fill up certainly during the height of the season of crossing, which is also during monsoon season, traditionally. And there will be a lot of rushing water here, but you have your concertina wire, you have your double meshing here. This is the Mexican side wall. This is the old wall. They just decided not to take that part down and leave it up. There is nothing but a sheer wall here, but you have a sloped wall here and a run that goes here. And there's a bridge right here with one of those big giant fences that opens up so that they can access it. And one of the things that you can't see very well that is right here is rebar stairs. So if somebody does fall in, they don't give them stairs to get up on the other side. They give them stairs to stay on the Mexican side, and again, so that they can get in and apprehend whomever it is. So it's done very intentionally. And this, 15 feet, it's huge. It's huge and it's wide. One of the other things that we noticed while we were in Israel and Palestine, especially in the Old City, is that there was a lot of liberty taken about controlling people's movement, restricting and controlling access and movement. Within and around the Old City, the police would walk around with these barriers and they would just set them up with no real understanding. Like, from an outsider's perspective, we couldn't really understand why they were setting it up. But they would set up these barriers and borders, and they would just refuse to let people in. There was no explanation. They just they would cut people off from being able to walk through entire streets. So these borders, these boundaries, were set up all over the place, and they seemed to be arbitrary, and then they would be gone the next day. So. And again, people in Israel and Palestine, they do what they do here at the U.S.-Mexico wall, they climb. People will cross. People will cross to work. And while we were actually there, we watched 3 gentlemen in an urban area jump the wall, which was terrifying to watch this. And they were jumping down into a road and then running out into a field. That same day, within actually about a half hour, we watched a man being beaten, pulled out of his car by IDF and being beaten, watching these gentlemen jump over the border wall. And we had been on a bus on our way to Jerusalem where it was stopped. And they have extra security guards, private security guards, kind of similar to like Halliburton, Blackwater, that hang out with the IDF at the crossings. And they entered our bus, and we were sitting in 2 separate places, and they pulled every single woman off the bus, including their children, without any reason, no explanation. I was the only one left, and I'm pretty sure that it's because I had a US passport, but I had a machine gun shoved into me, and they were yelling at me, telling me not to move, not to do anything. So my husband can't see what's going on. He can't see how terrified I am. But it's happening, and I don't know if I'm going to be pulled off the bus either. But they do take our passports. They did give them back. We were not pulled off the bus, not that particular day anyway. There was another day where we were, and they did take our passports. But watching these women and these children being dragged off the bus and then being corralled and taken off to a place where we don't know what's happening to them, the men fighting with the IDF soldiers, trying to figure out what they're doing with them, the men not being able to get off the bus. This is something that happens every day. It's arbitrary. Every experience that we had crossing in and out of Qalandia was very, very different. And honestly, some of the interior checkpoints here in the US, I'm not going to say that it's the same, but the arbitrariness of your experience is similar in that way. You never know what to expect. I was talking to a couple people here earlier before this and explaining that a year and a half ago, I was at an internal checkpoint outside of Arivaca, Arizona, and I was working, doing my field research for the season. And I was coming through the checkpoint on my way to Tucson, and I was attacked by one of the Border Patrol dogs in my car, and then I had a gun in my face by one of the agents who was telling me in explicatives that he was going to shoot me, and telling me I had to get out of my car while I was pinned under a dog with a gun this close to my face. So I had Border Patrol agents. Now I'm wearing a short skirt and a tank top. Border Patrol agents pulling me out of my car and dragging me into the desert over barbed wire. And I honestly thought I was going to die. I didn't know what they were going to do to me. So I managed to, because they didn't know I had my phone on me, I managed to send out a message to a humanitarian organization that I've spent years working with to let them know where I was. And when they figured out that I had alerted somebody about where I was and what was happening to me, they let me go eventually. So checkpoints can be dangerous. They're definitely dangerous for people who fit the phenotype of the other, the enemy, the threat. Certainly women and children are exposed to much more than men are, although I do have a friend in Arabaka who picked up a very sick migrant on the side of the road near one of the checkpoints, the internal checkpoints. And he put him in his car to drive him to the checkpoint to hand him off to the Border Patrol so he could get treatment. The Border Patrol pulled him out of the car and beat him so badly he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. So sometimes bad things happen at the checkpoints here too. And we just never know what's going to happen. So we have people who climb. They make different things, ropes, ladders, whatever, and do this. And IDF doesn't seem to be patrolling the same way that they do here at the U.S.-Mexico border on the walls themselves, which is a fascinating piece of that. They seem to be more concentrated either in the Old City, around Jerusalem, or at the checkpoints. Terror tunnels were a big thing that were talked about here, and also while we were over in the Middle East. And they were being talked about as being, tunnels of terror, where you smuggle explosives and rockets and all sorts of other contraband. A lot of the pictures I saw were people from Gaza who were smuggling sheep and other foodstuffs through the tunnels to feed their families. The diagrams here are some of the pictures that they would issue to the Israeli citizens to help sort of foster that threat narrative, so that people would say, I'm in danger. I have to support what they're doing right now. And then we also have the smuggling tunnels here at the U.S.-Mexico border, and there are lots of them. They're used to smuggle drugs, they're used to smuggle weapons, they're used to smuggle humans. They're used for all sorts of things. But these are similarities that we also share with them. If you're going to build a wall, people are either going to find their way over it or under it. And in parts of the border wall where people have actually dug under it, the Corps of Engineers, they go in and they just pour a bunch of cement in. That's been the fix that I've seen. One of the things I had mentioned earlier were Israeli-only roads. How they determine who's allowed to be on these roads and who's not allowed to be on these roads are license plates. Now, in Qalandia refugee camp, which is near the checkpoint, which is on the Palestinian side, the West Bank side of the wall, you're allowed to have a Jerusalem license plate, an Israeli license plate, which are the license plates that are yellow. This indicates that you can be anywhere you want. So because they are in Jerusalem by technicality, they get to have these plates, even though they live in the refugee camp on the West Bank side. So you do see these license plates. And it's interesting because there's this stoplight on the road to Ramallah that doesn't work. And it actually is the line that ends where Jerusalem is and where you start heading into Ramallah. And it's just a funny metaphor for what's actually going on there, and the perceived lines and the real lines. You have green plates, which it's harder to see here. You have your green plate with the white lettering and then the white plate with the green lettering. These are Palestinian plates. The green plates, is that right? The green plates are not allowed to leave? Neither are allowed to leave, but the ones with the white plates actually have a little more range. But those, if you have one of those two plates and you're found on an Israeli-only road, you're going to be arrested and sent to one of their segregated prisons. The prisons in Israel, you don't put Israelis and Palestinians together ever. They have a Palestinian-only prison, which is in bad shape. So you don't want to get sent to one of those. So anyone with those plates, they're not allowed to be there. So with all this said, one of the things that was really interesting, you have kids running around the West Bank, and what they have in their hands are plastic toy guns. They had plastic machine guns. You have a lot of people who are being trained at an early age to perpetuate what's been happening for 60 years on their side. What you have in Israel is a nation of people with PTSD. One of the things that was very striking to me was that in Israel there was a lot of recreation of concentration camp settings. When I was on the beach in Tel Aviv, they had the lifeguard station, which looked very similar to the guard towers that I saw in Auschwitz. But they were shorter, but they were also surrounded by rolls and rolls of concertina wire with these horns where people would speak in this unclear voice, and it was all very monotone and just talk. I had no idea what was being said. People didn't really pay attention to it. But it was very strange. And there's concertina wire everywhere. Everything is wrapped in wire. And it was very, very similar to the camps that I had visited when I was in Europe and Russia. And so we have people who are hurting. We have people who are in bad shape, who have not dealt with the things that have happened to their people in the past, and certainly not what's happening to them now. And there's just constant conflict. It's very similar here with the US and Mexico. We've had a lot of colonization, and certainly with the areas where traditionally we've had Native Americans living and everyone's been rounded up into these reservations, there is a lot of historical trauma and violence that is still not being dealt with, and it creates conflict. So I want to open up to questions from anybody. Yes?
I was going to ask, because your title and you use the term wall, and you use the term wall, and when I went to the border, I saw a wall, and but yet it's never called a wall; it's called a fence, as you know, in Washington. In Israel, the wall is termed a security barrier. What is it? I mean, maybe it's just what is it about walls that are bad PR? Why does the U.S. initially shy away from the term? What do you think?
I think within the general public, it is one of those things that is certainly used interchangeably, like a lot of terms. There is no real definition set aside, so people do use that interchangeably. I think that fence sounds nicer, and traditionally in the American lexicon, the word fence is something that keeps between neighbors, but is something that we can control, height-wise and privacy-wise and whatever. If you say wall, it sounds so ominous, and it sounds so permanent. And again, if we go back to the state of emergency and we go back to the state of exception, technically these things are being, and always have been talked about as not being a permanent solution, even though we keep making them bigger and better. And there are actual walls, but then they turn them into fences, and then they turn them back into walls. And there are so many different generations and designs that they have constructed. Whereas in Nogales, they used to have nothing but straight sheet metal walls. Now they've made it so that they're bars and you can see right through them. So is that a fence? Technically, yes. But one of the things that Washington has started doing, and not for the layman, of course, but they have started referring to it at large as a tactical infrastructure. So that's the new name. But we just keep calling it wall and fence, and I think that no one has any real preference. It's still there. Yes?
Thank you very much. It's a fascinating topic. Boundaries of diversity. It's very interesting. I think the closest thing, though, that in my life that I can relate to was 20 20 years ago in Belfast, and leaving the Peace Wall up there and making a taxi from one side to the other, the taxi driver had to change his license plates in order to be able to do that, and there were lots of large armored vehicles patrolling the streets all the time, and it was very, it's concerning, it's scary to kind of be there. And I was there again last year, 20 years later, with students who still thought it was very tense being in Belfast, but it was very different than 20 years ago.
I agree. I was actually there about 20 years ago myself, and looking at the bombed out guard towers that were sitting at the boundaries and borders, and there was actually shooting in the streets when I was there in Belfast, still going on. And I haven't been back since, so yeah, I would love to.
And they call that the Peace Wall.
The Peace Wall, yes. Well, I mean, if you go up north of Seattle to the Canadian crossing point there, they have the Peace Arch and the Peace Park. If you go down to Tijuana and San Diego, they have Friendship in Peace Park down there. So they try and say, like, even though we have put this big thing up in between everybody and people are standing at it crying because they haven't seen their mothers and fathers and children in several years, it's friendship. It's peace and friendship, and it helps everybody behave somehow. Yes?
Thank you as well for this topic. It was very interesting and also a bit concerning. Did you feel safe in when you were in Israel? I mean, you kind of describe it in that it doesn't sound very positive way, and not a very safe environment. And I'm just wondering, because clearly, you know, we have a very different view, I think, of the situation daily, and of the environment, and of the idea. And would you go back?
I would definitely go back. I would love to go back. I don't know when that's going to be able to be possible for us, but we definitely want to go back. I will tell you straight up, I felt safer in Ramallah than I did in Jerusalem. Because people were not as on edge. The thing about Israel, particularly Jerusalem, and I'm going to pick on Jerusalem, because the heightened security, the heightened threat narrative there is very different than the rest of the country. And again, IDF soldiers, very young, untrained IDF soldiers doing conscription, are carrying around very large machine guns everywhere, whether they're on or off duty. Just doing everyday things, carrying around these guns, and sort of like wielding them and knocking them into you, and it's a little jarring, but also the noise that the light rail makes when it's coming to a stop is so jarring. Everything is really jarring and loud and screechy, and everything feels very, very tense there, and people are watching you in a very different way. And again, because people thought he was an Israeli Jew, and that I was Palestinian, it created a slightly different tension for us because people were actively watching us, and with not nice looks on their faces. There was one particular couple I pointed out to him on the light rail, and I said, we're going to die. These people are going to come after us. Because that's the thing, in Jerusalem, people attack each other openly in the streets. So,
I have not an interesting perspective, and I think perhaps the lens that you're getting is because of the way visually people assume. But I've heard many, many people say that they've never felt more safe than in Jerusalem. Like, it's the safest city, and it was a great experience. It was, you know, I've never felt more safe.
I felt safer in Haifa and Tel Aviv for sure, even though here I was with, you know, I'm in the ocean with this beach, with this guard tower that I've just described to you, and an old dance hall that's been bombed out. I felt safer there because people were much more relaxed. But again, the perception of who we were and who we were to each other during a war, when people are being run over by cars in the streets waiting for a bus, or a bulldozer went and knocked over an entire bus, and then it's because, you know, like it comes out that the operator of the plow was Palestinian, and some Orthodox folks went and started attacking him with rocks. And he was trying to get away from them and accidentally flipped a bus over. So these are the things that were going on. And I mean, you can't even go to the mall without having your car inspected and going through metal detectors. You can't go anywhere without having this happen.
Part of their reality.
It's part of the reality, and that was the difference for us, is that it's not part of our reality in that same way. But I think...
Did you feel profiled?
Yes.
Do you have the same, or have you ever had the same experience in the United States on the Arizona-Mexico border?
I am a U.S.-born citizen.
You're a native, right?
I'm a native. I'm also Mexican-American. I obviously don't speak with an accent. I've been deported by ICE into Mexico. I had my documents from my university. I had my passport. I had everything. And I was still deported into Mexico.
How long were you held?
Oh, I walked the 2 miles to the Nogales crossing and crossed right back over.
Did you not show them your passport just to see if it really happened? Because it is fascinating.
Oh, they had everything. They took all of our documents, and they had everything, and they were typing and typing and typing and typing, and they still deported us. No, not my husband. I was with a professor at the time, who is also Mexican-American. And they said that we looked like migrants, because we were a little dirty. We had spent the week hanging out with migrants on the streets of Nogales, like conducting interviews. What's that?
I look dirty right now.
You know?
I just say to Tony that I had an actual shower this week, and I was like, oh, I don't look dirty. The desert does that to you.
The desert does that, especially if you're hanging out on some like rough streets, you know, and you're not showering and that sort of thing. But yeah, we had all of our documents. They had all of our documents, and they still deported us. So yes, I have been profiled many times. Yes.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, obviously in Mexico, but I like Mexico over in the Middle East, having the shooter experience of, I would say someone like myself, with very European, very white, blonde-haired, blue eyes, and the very kind of American, what European, experience a whole lot different. Like, they wouldn't do a screening, they would immediately do a something like that.
Yes. Yes, I believe that your experience would not be quite as volatile in that way, for sure. Although maybe in the West Bank, for example, we were out by the 2 refugee camps that are there, and we had somebody yell at us to go home. I mean, they clearly saw that we were not from either side, and told us, like, get out of there, go home, and stop staring at them, you know. So, I mean, maybe if you were in a similar situation, you would also get that same. We were also in the Muslim quarter in the Old City, and some little boy came running up to us, and he was like, the Jewish quarter's over there. So, you know, those things we would probably share experiences with, but as a whole, I think you would have an easier time of it based on that. You had a question?
Yeah, in a situation where your life is in danger, you know, you were pulled out of the car, here in America, it's very traumatizing, and I hate hear the stories like that. Did you do something about it? Like, did you try to screw them, or even your friend that got things experiencing on the side?
I and many, many other people right now are part of a large class action lawsuit on our behalfs through the ACLU here in Arizona, who is going after Border Patrol for these kinds of citizen abuses. So it's still going. So yes, yeah, I don't know what will happen, but yes.
Okay, so two questions. For the American side, what is legislation doing in terms of, well, you mentioned American Civil Liberties Union, how is legislation taking effect of discrimination of U.S. citizens and also aliens or aliens, whatever, that are not U.S. citizens in terms of the possible extension? The second part is, what about the United Nations peace, is it security resolution, I can't recall, that has been implemented over and over since 2005, of checking countries' jail cells to make sure that there's no abuse occurring often in terms of prisoner guards, just beating up innocent people without even causing any deterrence or harm, etc. That makes sense. You mentioned about going through the Palestinian side, or should be where all the cows are at, or something like that. It's just kind of like a farm equipment, but yeah, it's used for humans for detaining, etc. Has the United Nations took note of is this legal, is this ethical, etc.?
I'll start with the UN. The UN operates in funny ways. The UN has laws that has already been established for Israel. And routinely Israel gets slapped on the wrist. You're not supposed to do that. Shouldn't do that. Shouldn't do that. In the south of Israel, right now in the Negev, there are there are undocumented workers that have come up from Eastern Africa that are being imprisoned in the Negev where there's nothing out there and it's hot. And they are routinely abused. And it is widely, openly known that they're abused and that the conditions are inhumane. The UN knows about it and they don't do anything about it. So there are laws and there are checks and balances, but the UN picks and chooses what they pick on. For example, the wall. They in 1949 determined where the line was for Jerusalem, yet allowed Israel to still place the wall where they wanted to. And so, can you repeat the first part of your question?
What is going on in terms of legislation implementing a law so that there's no discrimination of the border patrol going beyond are you American citizen or like you said that you were going through a border patrol checkpoint in Douglas, Arizona, and they asked you questions that actually was not actually against law, wasn't even constitutional, other than are you American citizens. So what's legislation doing in terms of laws? I don't know. Not a law.
I totally understand where you're going.
Asking unconstitutional questions or harassing American citizens, because you go on YouTube, there's a phrase like a million views of CBP harassing American citizens, American soil. What's legislation doing about this?
Legislation is doing zero. It's doing absolutely nothing to combat that because Department of Homeland Security comes back and says it's a matter of national security. We're doing it for your safety, so suck it up.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
Is there going to be a solution sometime?
Not in the foreseeable future. No. One thing I did learn today, before I got here, is that somebody here in Arizona has implemented a new piece of legislation in Arizona, and it is H.R. 1232. And it is a bill to stop militarizing law enforcement because you may be aware that here in Arizona, local law enforcement has been asked to do things that is not in their job description, nor is it part of their jurisdiction. So this is Representative Hank Johnson Jr., who has introduced this bill, and it's brand new, and so it'll be interesting to see where that goes, trying to let local law enforcement agencies off the hook for doing the job of ICE and CPB at large. I don't know much about it. I still need to do a little bit of reading, but that's something that you might want to look into. That might be a start of something about what you're asking, but aside from that, there is not a thing being done, and they have not indicated any intention to do so. Yes?
So you were talking about the Tohono reservation.
Tohono.
And it's between the Mexican and the United States border. So you were saying something about when the people there died, that
Unauthorized migrants.
unauthorized migrants. You were saying something that when they died, that the United States or Mexico was going to help them take care of it. Were these people, was their death because they were unauthorized migrants, or did they naturally die? Or, because if they're natural death, I can understand why no one would help them take care of the death, and I would think that they would have their own spiritual tradition of burial ceremonies, so I don't get that.
Unauthorized migrants coming through the Tohono reservation are on their way somewhere else. Often, they die of exposure. They die from not having enough food or water or heat stroke. And so they die while walking to get to their next destination. They happen to be walking through the reservation, because the elements are extreme out there. There is a process where if you do not get enough water, dehydration is not even the worst of your problem.
So
at that point.
because their reservation is separated by the border and the territories that the two countries are going through, they have identified exposure because they're trying to get from one place to the other.
They're walking 100 miles, 200 miles. What can I help you with?
No, I'm just trying to figure out, like, it's not like in our place to, like, assist if they don't want it, but I'm thinking, like, could we make it easier specific? Because you already said that they had, concessions for them, but are they not allowing any more concessions, or is it just the laws implementing between local countries? Or can we provide them with vehicles or like four-wheelers? I don't know, like, how can we stop like a culture being destroyed while still having, well, it may not be like the most peaceful border. I know it's not like the most gruesome in the world.
It is illegal to transport anybody here who is undocumented in any way, shape, or form. People who are caught with somebody who is unauthorized can get up to 20 years in prison. And people have been put away for that. Aiding and abetting a known felon, which is what undocumented people are once they cross over that line, is a whole different ball of wax, and people have been sent to prison for that. There are humanitarian agencies, as well as a gentleman who is a Tohono member named Mike Wells, who goes out and puts out water for people so that stop dying out there. But, and this is well documented, Border Patrol goes out and destroys the bottles of water or steals the supplies that people leave out there.
So the other Native American territories in the United States, are they considered not, what would other Native American states in the United States actually in the border of the United States be considered? Are they not?
That's a whole different question. So reservations are supposed to be sovereign nations,
Yeah.
but they're not. The Border Patrol helps themselves to the nations that are along the U.S.-Mexico border, and oftentimes along the Canadian border
So
too.
Native Americans within the United States are citizens then, or become citizens as they're born with generations? Or are they just territorial, just kind of?
Yes.
So are they like undocumented as equivalent
No.
to?
The people who live on the reservation are not the undocumented folk. People coming up from Mexico, Central America, are the undocumented folk. They happen to be walking through their reservation. And those are the people that we're discussing. And so
I'm worried
when,
about the Native Americans. I'm not
Well, I'll tell you something. There have been a lot of people on the Tohono Reservation, including kids, who have been killed by the Border Patrol because Border Patrol oftentimes cannot distinguish between a Latino and a Native American. And so there have been people who've been beaten to death, and there are people on the Tohono Reservation who are afraid to leave their houses because they are constantly harassed and attacked and arrested because they're being mistaken for an undocumented person.
So, undocumented people from, say, Mexico they're using the reservation, am I saying it right?
Tohono O'odham. It's a tough one.
Reservation to get through to the United States. They're using the reservation, and because the 200-mile span of these people's territory, they accidentally get shot or they're endangered because other people are using their source of land to get through the United States. So people from ICE and like the Border Patrol are killing them accidentally, trying to keep the others away.
Killing them, I accidentally is kind of a rough way to talk about it, but yes. So Tohono O'odham members are being mistaken for undocumented migrants from other countries and have been abused, arrested, and killed.
But they're not specifically like dying.
Who?
The Native Americans.
No, that's what I'm saying is that the Native American Tohono people are being...
mistaken they are.
Yes. But, no, they're not crossing through their own lands undocumented.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's
Right.
sorry.
Okay.
Although I do have my friend's mom was born in Mexico.
Yeah.
I still don't know all. She's born in Mexico and she's in business.
Mhm.
Nobody knows. But it happens a lot.
It happens a lot. A lot of my people, the Yaqui, because the Yaqui also extend tremendously in and out of Mexico. A lot of my people have like gone back to Mexico because one, they don't have reservations in Mexico, and the land has been treated differently, not better necessarily, but treated differently. Therefore, the people are treated a little bit differently, and they prefer to be there instead. So they've given up their citizenship here to go back. But Pascua Yaqui don't have the same ability to cross back and forth that the Tohono do, because the reservation isn't right on the border. So it gets sticky. Yeah. Yes.
You made a comment about volunteers putting water out for these folks. And last week, for anyone who might be interested in this, the Sierra Club representative was up here talking over at Preston College. And they have a Borderlands program where there are volunteers that go out and that are not on the Tohono reservation, but out in Arizona, and I don't know about going into California, but they have a program where they go out and put supplies and water, and they're encountering the same experience that you described, where it's often destroyed. But nonetheless, they keep putting it out there. And so that's a program that if anyone's interested, you can, I've got a site for the Sierra Club.org Borderlands program. If anybody wants to get it from me, I'll give it to you. But I had a question.
Yes.
And my question was, when you were visiting Israel, did you interview any Israelis and learn of their opposition to this wall and these circumstances? And if so, what were they saying they were going to do to bring about a change to that situation?
The way Israelis talk about this particular situation of conflict is very different than the way Americans do. And I would go so far as to say that the freedom to enact and act upon these things that they see as injustices is not quite as open and free as it is here. We did talk to people, some young people, who had gone through their conscription and had some opinions about stuff, and they were very careful about the way that they talked about it, but it was clear that they didn't feel comfortable supporting what was but also seemed relegated to the idea that they didn't have a whole lot of control. There wasn't much that they could do. And that was just their reality, and it's how they grew up, and it was just the way it was. So we didn't meet any activists, per se. However, a couple of weeks ago, before the elections, we did see that big protest in Tel Aviv. So maybe since we have been there, something's changed and shifted over for people in a way that they see an avenue for them to actually act upon this sort of thing and engage in fighting back. Does that make sense?
No, what was, of all the people with whom you spoke, what was the split? What was the consensus? Most of the people, or what percentage was in favor of this, I'm just going to call it, this oppressive circumstance, and how many were opposed?
It seemed like a lot of the young secular people were opposed to it in some form or another. I don't have any numbers to give you as far as, and again, because the ability and freedom to talk about this sort of thing is vastly different than it is here. And so it wasn't as free and flowing with being open with that kind of dialogue. So it was hard to say, and a lot of it was trying to read through the language that they were using to talk about how they were feeling about it without being super explicit. It's hard to say, but it also depended quite a bit on what part of the country we were in. For example, Jerusalem, going to be harder to find people who are going to be, one, outspoken, and two, maybe against this sort of thing, because it's more orthodox. Whereas in Tel Aviv, you have a lot of secular young people, and I felt like people just felt differently there. And we met some people in Haifa who were just like, this is silly. You know? So I think it was a regional thing, and also based in how committed people were to the culture as well as the religion. That's the best I can answer it. There was one other person back here. Yeah?
Thank you for coming out, by the way. I do appreciate it.
Thank you.
I do want to talk about the Israeli wall. Could we talk about the successes of it in dropping the number of car bombings, killing Israelis to zero after its completion?
I'm not so sure that I would say that it dropped to zero.
I'm using kind of
While we were there, one of the things that I have to point out again is that Israel decided to take it upon themselves to build the wall in the way that they did through Jerusalem, instead of putting it on the UN line where they would be supposed to be doing this. They put it around the old city. So there are Palestinian neighborhoods still on the Israeli side of the wall, and there are some really pissed off people, especially the youth. And there were incidences where a young Palestinian would drive their car into people waiting for a bus. We were in the bus station and were evacuated out for a bomb scare. There was perceived as a Palestinian youth on a motorcycle who started shooting at a bus. And this is all while we were there. So
the conflict, the most recent.
Yes.
Okay, so this is
correct. Yeah, this is very recent. So honestly, I don't feel like I can answer that question well, because I don't know that I know enough. I know a lot about the bombings and you know, on the buses and stuff like that. I grew up watching that from over here. But the success rate, I don't think I know enough to answer that question for you. And that would be something I would have to look into. Or at least who perceives what as being a success, right? I mean, it's definitely separated people.
Of course.
And it's definitely separated families. So if we call that a success, Israel would call it a success. then it has definitely separated people in a way and restricted their movement and their access to certain things in that way. The old city, though, is still very contentious, and riots happen there all the time. While we were there, there were Palestinian youth who started throwing rocks and engaged with the IDF, and there was a small riot there. This is one of the things I meant to talk about was weaponry. This may help you understand some things about.
I'm a former Marine infantryman, so I'm pretty familiar with all of this.
Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, we can have a discussion then about this. So, IDF has some of the best equipment in the world. Right. Now, one of the things that can be a problem that a lot of people don't understand because they're not told is that Palestinians, whether it's in the West Bank or it's in Gaza, have very little access to things. So we have rocks, we have sticks, we have fashioned ladders, we have the missiles, for example, that were being sent over by Hamas. They don't explode. They don't explode. They don't have access to the materials to create an exploding missile. So they were shooting off empty tubes that would just go boom. Whereas IDF had these like high-end exploding rockets, and including, with the Iron Dome. With the way that the wall has happened, it has made it much harder for people in the Palestinian areas to access materials to create explosives. I suppose that is one way we can talk about that. So the threat has been reduced by limiting the availability to the materials to build such things.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was a whole incident with them trying to bring in, there was a ship a few years ago that they tried to bring into the West Bank in order to offload arms and ammunition for Hezbollah, Hamas, and their feelings. But I did want to kind of maybe give you a little insight into the checkpoint systems that you had seen.
Yes.
So the controlling of movements is extremely important in a static defensive position because you don't move.
Could you speak up just a little louder?
Sure. The defense of your position, you're static, everybody else can move around you, so your threats can as well. The reason why you saw police barriers come up at random points, taking out in certain streets, certain alleyways, and certain things like that, is to continuously change the baseline. You continuously change the baseline, your enemy cannot pick up and find a routine in which to insert themselves in attack. So it's very effective in that sense. They have to be. If you don't have, if you don't change things up, you will get killed by a sniper, you will get killed by a car bomb or suicide vest. They'll pick up on your patterns, is what they're trained to do. When you were mentioning the surveillance systems, I found it kind of weird. It almost ended on a negative connotation, that the surveillance was inappropriate. Or I'm just not clear.
I wouldn't say that it's inappropriate. My point was to state that as much money and time and effort and contracting as we have spent in this country on developing this stuff, the ineffectuality of it has been profound. And that really is, I guess, where my negative connotation comes off about that sort of thing, is because we are piecemealing together a hobbling system that does not work, which is one of the reasons, and against a lot of people's wishes, why President Obama decided to end the virtual fence system back in 2010. But given that happened, Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, and organizations like that who were vying for the new contract said, okay, this is where we're making mistakes. Now we have to pick it up in order to get that contract. So that's what's happened since then. New designs have been created and Boeing got the contract back. So now they're working specifically on those biometric systems first, so that they can make it effective and put it in a broad spectrum way along the entirety of the border, rather than having the virtual fence, which was, the radius was like 2 miles.
I remember, I listened to NPR, they talked quite a bit about that, and the systems and capabilities of it. I did find it interesting when you were talking about the Honeymooning tribe. I did quite a bit of work down there. And then your go home comment that you got when you were in Israel, I laughed a little bit on the inside because I got the same comment when I went to the Nation from the people there.
Yeah.
It's an interesting, you point out, nobody likes anybody. At the end of the day, when it comes down to dealing down these territories, and the work we were doing, we would actually have to be armed.
Yeah.
Because the threat was constant. It's not just an arbitrary overnight. You might run into something, of course there's that. It'll always be there. But there are legitimate threats of people just being, you can walk out and take a 12-gauge shell in the back of the head every day.
Of course. But we also have to take into consideration that the people who fight against foreigners in their space are the people who are exploited the most, who are treated the most poorly. There are a lot of looky-loos. On Honeymooning, there are camera crews and humanitarians, all sorts of people who exoticize them and try and align themselves in a way with them that they have no understanding of the tribe or Americans in general. And so it gets exhausting when you have people knocking on your door uninvited, saying things to you in a way that are ignorant statements or invasive statements and that sort of thing. And so recognizing that conflict is super important. I mean, I was in somebody else's space and I was painfully aware of it and trying to be as respectful as possible within my knowledge base. But just my simple presence there, yeah.
It ratchets up that tension.
Abs-
You can feel it.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Well, thank you, ma'am. I do appreciate it.
Thank you. Yes?
So all the similarities are between two borders that have hypothetically very different reasons for creating this infrastructure of walls, surveillance. And just to clarify, in Israel-Palestine border situations, it is military. I mean, it is a terrorist. That's why this was built. I mean, I understand the politics, but that's the military scenario. But then on the Mexican, Arizona, California border, it's not a military. So I guess I'm confused at this point. What threat are we talking about? Is it economic? Is that how it's characterized? Is it real? And I just don't get it. It seems like a disjunction between this military presence against what is not a military threat.
I mean, some people do refer to unauthorized migrants as economic refugees. So it is an economic thing. It also is a nationalist thing. It is a patriotic thing.
It's not a military.
It's not necessarily a military threat, although I have had Border Patrol agents spend tons of time trying to convince me that they have found corners and prayer rugs out there. I have been working that area, I've been working those trails for years, and I have not once found any evidence of that. But when the argument for keeping these things in place starts to fall apart, we have to develop and enhance the threat. So it's easy to say terrorism. It's easy to say because there are people who have bought into the terrorist threat narrative.
But it's total fiction.
That may be true, but there are people who don't believe that's the case. Fox News.
Really? Okay. All right.
Right? People who believe that they're under some sort of threat, whether it's their jobs, their livelihood, their religion, their culture, their way of life, their freedom, whatever they want to call it.
Right, but that happens within our border as
Yes.
well. I mean, so this is why it is very, I admire your freedom.
Thank you.
And I can see why it's
It's a complicated situation, and the language that's used in and around all of these conversations is so convoluted.
yeah.
And it's hard to crack through that and understand what people are actually saying. I have a variety of languages I speak now, just having worked on the border here. Being it people who live on the reservation, being it people who live in Aravaca, being it the Border Patrol. Like, I have a variety of languages I now speak because they all use different vernaculars. And each one means something and it's symbolic of something. And I have to know what that is. And everybody firmly believes what they're saying, whether it's real or perceived.